Hello again. Let's talk about a fun one today. Let's talk about global warming or global cooling, or let's get just a teeny bit political today. Um, One of the big owies that occurred in Europe just after Genghis Khan went through, that was a serious owie. There were three owies that caused Europe to change seriously at the onset of the 1300s. The first one was Genghis Khan, and he went from roughly the 12s, all through the 12s. We had the Mongol influence changing the way that things were happening in Europe. Number two was what is sometimes called the Little Ice Age. And what this is basically that the global temperature cooled pretty much at the onset, let's say, of the late 12s, early 1300s. There was a global decrease in temperature, only a couple of degrees. But a couple of degrees is huge when you talk about the year seasons and the growing seasons. For example, if this is from January to December, and I am a farmer, I've got to get in my crops, and I've got to get my crops out of the ground, and they need time to grow. So let's start with over here on this side. Let's start with snow. Here's my winter. Finally, the snow leaves the ground thaws a little bit, and I can get out there and get my plow in it. Good. I have a certain number of days in which to get my plow in, turn the ground, and get the crops into the ground. Then they grow. Then I have a certain number of days for them to be harvested and get them out of the ground before snow comes again. That's welcome to the life of a farmer. Crops, of course, take a certain number of days to grow. Peaches take longer, let's say, than apples, or rice takes a different number of days than wheat, whatever it may be. But accordingly, the farmers would grow the crop which they could produce locally within the confines of the season, with the winter storms. So Europe was used to a certain type of harvest in a certain number of days. With the onset of the 1300s, that changed, because as the cold came down, it was so cold that there were times when for example, England used to have a lot of grapes. They actually produced quite a bit of wine. Nothing to rival the French, I might say, but still. And what happened? It went away. We don't talk about English wine anymore. That's not even an option. Iceland was a country which used to have a pretty good sized population. They talk about their wheat crops. They talk about their hay crops. Why do you and I say Iceland? Wheat? Those two words don't seem to fit on the same sentence, do they? Before the 1300s, Iceland had wheat and raised crops, and once the onset of the 13s occurred, that changed. The population dropped by more than 50% because it simply could not, the crops could not sustain that many people. Greenland, don't you ever wonder where Greenland got its name? Because that's got to be a misnomer. It's covered with ice, isn't it? It didn't used to be covered with that much ice. It was during this period that the ice came down from the north, that glaciers increased all across Scandinavia, certainly through the Alps. There were records of whole towns in Switzerland that were covered by the encroaching glaciers where they moved down. Contrast that with today's media, of course, which talks about the glaciers receding, the glaciers disappearing, the glaciers are going to go away. Just remember that it hasn't always been that way. This is a modern phenomenon. Now, why did it happen is the question. I think that the easiest answer is sunspots. We have records of sunspots going back almost 500 years. We don't have them any longer than that because we didn't have telescopes. Galileo records a very distinct lack of sunspots in the 1600s, which just happens to coincide perfectly with the lowest, coldest time in this entire period. I mean, we're coming along at this level of temperature. Starting in the 13s, it dips. It goes up and down in three different waves by the time we get into present day. But the biggest dip was from 1650 to 1700 during let's say the reign of Louis XIV. Coldest time that we ever had. And so Holland was used to having people skating on the ice. Welcome to a Bruegel painting that depicts Holland in the winter and people doing that. All of the ponds froze. The canals going through Amsterdam were all ice. And you and I say, well, yeah, that's the way it was. It wasn't always like that. These things change. And they happen not because of what you and I do, but because of sunspots. with all apologies to Al Gore, I don't agree with him at all. I simply do not agree with that. I think that that is fake science. The invention of the automobile, the invention of the combustion engine, the steam engine, fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, the exhaust coming out of your car, all those things don't amount to that much when compared to a volcano. One volcano will do more than everything man has done since the invention of the engine. We don't make that much difference. We think we do, but we don't. Two examples. In about 1815, there was a major eruption of a volcano in the South Pacific. It brought on what was called the year without a summer. And in that year, the volcano put enough ash out into the stratosphere, which then the winds took around the globe, that the global temperature dropped sufficiently that the whole place never got warm. We never did see summer. It was winter for a full year. That's recorded in lots of history books. Okay, that dissipated, and now we're back to normal again. Second example, if man were responsible for global warming, then we, I think, should have seen a severe spike upward during World War II, during the 40s, when we had lots and lots of automobiles and tons of aircraft and ships and everything else, which had absolutely no concern for exhaust. Watch the old movies and you'll see airplanes taking off or ships belching the blackest of clouds of smoke you've ever seen. All of that into the atmosphere didn't make any difference. As a matter of fact, in the 1940s, there's a distinct dip downward, not up, down, in temperature. Now, if it's man-caused, why didn't it go the other way? I think that we don't make enough difference. I know. Well, some difference, any difference has got to be better. I don't think it makes any difference, guys. No matter what we do, it doesn't make any difference. In the long haul, it doesn't. It's sunspots. And those go in very definite cycles, and we can track them. 11-year cycles is how it works. We're at the end of one of those cycles. We'll probably see cooler temperatures for the next decade. We've seen warming temperatures in the past decade. That's the way it works. But today's media would have you believe otherwise. So what happened as a result of all of this? With this dip down that started in the 1300s, number one, the growing season shortens. Number two, because of that, food supplies decrease. Number three, as a result, we have famine, we have starvation, and we have whole populations starting to shrink, which, number four, leads to one of the biggest problems that ever hits Europe, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. I'll talk about that one next time.